This interview explores one simple question. How do we make unconditional basic income a reality in Taiwan and around the world? I'm Tyler Prohaska, the chairman of UBI Taiwan, a grassroots organization in Taiwan that conducts original research and advocacy for unconditional basic income policies. Today, I have the privilege of introducing my dear friend and colleague, James Davis. James, in the past, has worked for UBI Taiwan. He came in the summer of 2017 as a field research coordinator and became our VP of research. He was helping us do research on the white paper for the feasibility of implementing UBI in Taiwan. He remains on our board of advisors and is a good friend of us here in Taiwan. But he's currently located in the United States and pushing basic income there. He recently worked for the Andrew Yang campaign in New Hampshire. So it's great to have James with us today.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Tyler. We go way back, and my work with UBI Taiwan has been probably the most rewarding project I've ever had the privilege of being a part of. Your supporters, your volunteers, and your team never cease to amaze and inspire me.
And it's also worth mentioning that James has done a lot of research in the academic sphere for UBI. James is a master's student at the University of California, Saul Price School of Public Policy, and he is waiting to enter into the Harvard Kennedy School next fall. Of course, he also holds degrees in economics and East Asian history from Columbia University. So a lot of background in academics that he's using for basic income research. James has also held research positions at the Stanford Center on Poverty and Inequality and the Berkeley City Council. So a lot of different roles, James, that you've used to think about basic income, talk about basic income. So I really want to jump right into understanding how do we make unconditional basic income a reality in Taiwan?
Sure. And I think these principles are true all over the world. Our communication strategy really needs to do three things. The first is that we need to use our personal stories. The second is that we need to put people first in our organizing when we assemble people and put together teams to advocate for basic income. And third, we need to fight for universal basic income from within systems of power, not just from the outside. And so those three general principles, using your own story, putting people first in your organizing, and working within systems of power, those are the methods by which we're going to accomplish basic income in Taiwan or elsewhere.
Well, certainly personal stories do a lot to mobilize others. I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about your own economics background.
Sure. So I was raised by a single mom in a small town Kansas trailer park. Growing up, if it weren't for school programs, we would have gone hungry. There was constant neighborhood crime and instability. My mom was always working multiple jobs as a fast food worker, a custodian, and a nurse to make ends meet. The end result of all of this stress that these circumstances put us under was a really fractured relationship and mistreatment. And as she struggled with this unbearable stress, it spilled over to my education and to my mental health as well. And this is a common thing that single mothers endure in the United States and everywhere. She always instilled in me the value of hard work and education, though. She was a great parent for that reason. In high school, I took her inspiration and always loved working a lot of jobs. So I was a Christmas tree salesman for a while, a wedding DJ, a shooting range worker, a church janitor, and a pizza sign boy, dancing out in front of traffic. Because I excelled in school and was lucky enough to have teachers that saw potential in me, privilege a lot of people don't have, I was able to matriculate to Columbia University on a full financial aid scholarship. And it's not a common route that people get in life. So I've been very privileged to have done that and gotten that degree. So that's a little bit about my economic background.
Well, unfortunately, even having a college degree can't necessarily save you from poverty because all those different factors come into play even after graduation, no matter what college that you might go to. So I'm
Mhm.
wondering if you'll tell us a little bit more about what it's been like having that background and combined with your life since graduation.
Well, I think regardless of where any of us have gone to college or high school, at the end of the day, a degree is just a piece of paper if you don't have the network that accompanies it. At Ivy League schools like Columbia, there's a lot of students that are legacies. Almost half of the undergraduate class comes from the top 10% of income earners because privileges in secondary education and high school accumulate over time. And so you're right, getting a college degree is no longer a surefire path straight out of poverty. With temp jobs on the rise, with uh, housing costs in the United States and Taiwan being at what feels like all-time highs, um, just getting that education isn't necessarily going to fix your life, or even getting a job won't perhaps fix it either. Since graduation, despite all the prestige and experience I've had working with you all, Columbia Business School funded some of the research that Tyler and I did. I've really struggled. When I was working at the Stanford Center on Poverty and Inequality, I was actually having to live in my car because California has an affordable housing crisis. And so there was always just a bit of irony advocating for policies to help poverty while still very much being in the thick of it, having to save a lot of money in case my mom isn't able to pay her medical bills as a Walmart cashier. And I think that these drawbacks accumulate even after you graduate from college.
I think the candidness is going to mean a lot to a lot of listeners, especially those who might be struggling themselves, even
Yeah.
in an economy where, we see that it's so-called low unemployment, but the reality is much different. So I want to come back to how has balancing poverty and trying to get through college, life after college, how have you balanced that experience?
Sure. And, this situation is not unique to me. And that's one thing our generation needs to recognize. Almost 30% of 29-year-olds still live with their parents in the United States. I would guess that that statistic is probably very true in other developed countries as well. And it's because housing costs and stagnant wages have really just perpetuated disaster for the lower and middle classes as income inequality reaches record highs. The hardest part, I'd say, about having to cope with poverty in college, before and after, is just lacking the resources to help people you love. And it's a big reason why I support UBI. For example, my mom, working at Walmart as a cashier, almost 70% of her income goes toward paying her health insurance deductible. Unlike Taiwan, the US has a healthcare system where private insurers make huge profits by denying claims. Um, my mom's job might also be automated in the near future before she even reaches retirement age, which is 5 years away. And so she'll have to sell her home, her car, and just about everything she owns to fight off bankruptcy if that happens, because she has lupus to be a debilitating disease already. And so if I don't find a high paying job soon, I won't be able to do anything to help her other than, go bankrupt myself. I'm also very touched and concerned by our mutual friend Crystal from our hometown in Kansas. She's like a sister to both of us. She grew up in a privatized Kansas foster care system after her parents lost custody. She's been forced to do anything she could to survive and take care of her two kids. And what this country does to poor women and their kids is a moral stain on our national consciousness. We should be ashamed of ourselves for allowing this type of poverty to persist. Uh, she didn't even get a high school education after that system chewed her up and spit her out. Means tested welfare, with all its good intentions, is riddled with loopholes that make her ineligible. She can't get SNAP or even free and reduced lunches, costs for lunches for her kids because she still lives with her separated husband. She gets a job, banks are going to garnish her wages because she had to go into debt when she was just surviving and trying to make it on her own, something many Americans experience. So the hardest thing about poverty and what it does to our moral consciousness and why I care about UBI and UBI Taiwan is that it tears us away from not only our life aspirations, but it makes it harder for us to be there for the people we love most.
I think that's absolutely right. And a lot of folks will say she should pull herself up by her bootstraps or whatever the phrase is. But the irony is when you're under that type of pressure, that stress pushes you back into poverty and it makes it almost impossible to escape. So in that type of situation, especially with welfare adding to that stress, I think it makes a lot of sense to support universal basic income so that we don't predicate survival on whether or not you are working.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I wanted to share a really jarring statistic. According to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, to quote them, a family with one full-time worker earning the minimum wage cannot afford the local fair market rent for a two-bedroom apartment anywhere in the United States. Nowhere. Work does not set you free, and work is being automated away at lightning speeds for people in the lower American caste. And even jobs that aren't automated, there'll still be a lot of job categories around. I don't want to be an alarmist on that issue. But the type of work that people are doing is literally killing us too. The stress of surviving in this work schedule. Suicides are the highest they've ever been around the globe, and so are drug overdoses by people that are structurally unemployed or just left behind by this rigged economy.
So I want to turn back to one of the central lessons on making UBI a reality.
Mm-hmm.
Recently, you were working for Andrew Yang in New Hampshire on his presidential campaign.
Yep.
Andrew, of course, is a businessman turned presidential candidate trying
Yep.
to run for president on universal basic income policy. And as a Taiwanese American, we were very fortunate to have Andrew give us an interview for one of our annual conferences with you. Of course, he's really smart and witty, and of course, a caring guy.
Yes, absolutely. So I've been in between jobs for a little while, so I wanted to move to New Hampshire to work for the campaign as a field organizer. He's one of the few presidential hopefuls that has ever run on a universal basic income policy. He's the only one. Uh, you know, I've made thousands of phone calls and knocked on maybe thousands of doors too for his campaign, and that's given me some really unique insights into communicating universal basic income policy. One of these key ways that we're going to make UBI a reality. So I guess one common thing that happens when you see someone on the street or you visit their doorstep to talk about Yang is people have heard of UBI a lot of times as either a proposal to give everyone $1,000 a month, and they don't have any details beyond that, or they think it's giving everyone free money. And so the reason why it was really rewarding to work for Andrew's campaign is it opened up opportunities to explain why that money is so important and the dynamic costs of not giving people a basic income and allowing poverty to persist and really overwhelm the American economy. So I think the most important thing that I could do is communicate what it meant to me personally, what a basic income would mean, but also to the people that I loved. So I want to do an exercise with the folks that are listening. I want us all to take a deep breath, and I want you to imagine what you would do with $1,000 a month. So we're going to take 5 seconds, do another couple deep breaths. Okay, so now you got this image in mind of what you would do with that $1,000 a month, or what's the amount that UBI Taiwan is proposing, Tyler, in NTD?
About 10,000 or 300 US dollars.
Got it, got it. So imagine what you would do with that type of guaranteed income. For some of us, it's paying off student loans. For folks that don't have student loans, it might be saving to go to school, or putting it in a retirement account, getting a new car so that you can go to work or get a new job. No matter what it is, the biggest point I want to convey in this interview is that your story is the most powerful thing that you have. Your dad's disability, your desire to move to a new city and start a new career. These are the communication devices that actually get people interested in basic income. Even though they may ask questions about the cost or the feasibility, that story is what's going to stick with them after you step off their porch and after you finish the conversation. So time and time again, I saw that people listened, and they listened hard to personal narratives about how UBI would help people.
And how would you generalize that lesson to activists and to Taiwan who might be campaigning for a candidate? We have a couple of third-party candidates who are talking about UBI, but maybe those who are not necessarily campaigning for particular candidates.
Sure. So UBI Taiwan, of course, doesn't directly advocate for any candidates, but we want to inspire everyone to join this conversation and be politically mobilized toward talking to people and supporting candidates that you think, speak well of this issue. So as UBI Taiwan might prepare to launch volunteers to gather signatures for a referendum on universal basic income, or if a legislator puts forward a bill to make it law, we will succeed if we are sharing our stories. We are not convincing people when we chat with them. We don't want to convince them that UBI is necessarily best for them, since we won't know their backstory. We don't know all the details of their life. They might even end up be paying more in taxes, depending on their income level or whether they own real estate. So we're not trying to convince them that it's best for them, or even that it's necessarily best for everyone, since it's kind of hard for people to think in the big picture. Millions of people would be affected by this policy. So it's hard for our tiny human brains to wrap our mind around those big picture benefits sometimes, especially if they're not into politics. So you really got to speak to the heart, and you've got to convince them that this is going to help you, or it's helping someone who you love. And so that small friendship and solidarity that you can build with them by sharing your story in that single conversation is going to stick with them. People don't remember data. People don't remember big statistics. They forget facts. Tyler, you forget facts all the time, even though you're one of the smartest guys I know. But people don't forget stories, and they'll find a way to connect it to their own lives or characters in their lives. Your story might sound like their brother's story, for example.
We get asked some of the same questions at a lot of the events that we do, and one of them, of course, is how do you pay for it? Mm-hmm. So in that type of conversation, what would you say the response should be?
Well, this is another great piece of advice for political advocacy in general. My advice is always to nod, listen, and validate what they are saying. If they ask you a question about the policy, tell them it's a smart question. It is. It's a great question to ask where the money is coming from. It shows that they care about what you have to say. So you can tell them that's a very smart question, or I had the same question too before I started volunteering. That empathy and connection matters more than your answer itself, believe it or not. Using words like our and community, which psychologists have found to prime people to think more about others, is going to help a lot as well. So to answer technical questions, I would just be simple and sweet. If they're concerned about cost, point out that UBI would solve childhood poverty and a lot of general poverty, which costs countries like the US over $1 trillion a year. As those kids grow up from childhood poverty, they have worse health conditions that's passed on to our healthcare premiums and public hospitals. They some of them might commit more crime, and some of them are going to fail to keep jobs. They're going to be less productive because the mental health burden that childhood poverty caused them. So after you've discussed those dynamic costs of doing nothing, which people don't tend to think about as much because they're invisible, then recenter the conversation again around the personal cost to you or a loved one. Always bring it back to those costs that are actually tangible to people, that they can feel. Dollars and number signs, they matter, but they're not going to be as strong of a persuasion tool as you think they are, unless maybe you're talking to someone with a really advanced degree who is very into numbers and math and government, which isn't most people, right? If they ask about funding, I would put it in a greater context. The state of Alaska in the US already has a universal basic income that it funds with oil revenues. The US government already has the Social Security Administration, which is a basic income for people over the age of 65. China has a DBAO, where they give basic income out to people with varying success because it's mean tested. Tribes in the United States have given basic incomes to their people with great success. The Eastern Cherokee experiment showed that it really alleviated mental health and conflict problems within families. And then maybe ask them carefully what they think the best way to fund this would be, right? Because that's not necessarily dictated yet. A lot of people that support UBI, they're saying, this is a really important cause. A legislature will ultimately, drill into those details of how it gets funded. So ask them how they want to fund it, because then you can frame the conversation around what they already believe. And you might even learn something from them too. And I kind of want to put a question back at you, Tyler. In your experience, do people who are very knowledgeable of economics and government policy still like a good personal story?
I would bring it to one of the experiences we had with an individual who was on the youth committee for the central government here in Taiwan. He presented it to the premier of the Republic of China, our official government here, and the premier said actually that for his first reaction was, what are people's individual behaviors going to be like? He brought up gambling and playing video games and this and that. And it wasn't really about the cost at first, although he did bring that up later. But it was intriguing that his first reaction is, how are people going to use this money? So my takeaway from that is, even with government officials, they want to see that it's making individuals' lives better, that people are using it in a way that's empowering them and not hampering them. So even with government officials, if you can hand them those stories of empowerment, that they've used UBI in a way that's improved their own life, I think that actually does quite well. That's quite effective, even regardless of whether they're experienced in government or not.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this question of how people will spend the money is one that comes up as well too when we did hustle text for the campaign, which is where you just text potential voters. You'd sometimes get a text back saying they'd spend it all on drugs and they were joking. The thing is, there's a lot of research, a very, very ubiquitous body of research showing that cash transfers do not increase consumption of sin goods. Like, people don't smoke more, people don't drink more. In fact, a lot of those habits are born of stress and poverty, right? You're going to be more vulnerable to cigarette advertising if you're not able to access an education. You're going to use those cigarettes to self-treat depression and stress from your job. People do it all the time. So a lot of the worst habits that we have in life are actually a result of this work survival economy. And so again, giving that personal narrative and that personal story might be more, palatable than just summarizing the research, right? Because who has time to memorize like the dates of? I think it was Banerjee who did like the biggest study of cash transfers to determine whether it increases sin goods. I don't even remember the date and title of that, but I've read it at least, you know, 3 or 4 times. So forget the technocratic evidence and explanations. Just go for the personal stories and point out how a lot of addiction and a lot of bad habits is just born from chronic stress.
Your second lesson for making UBI reality is to put people first. Can you
Yeah.
explain what you mean by that?
Yeah. And I think that if you treat people well, they will surprise you beyond your wildest dreams. If someone disagrees with you about UBI, but you treat them with respect and you tell them to have a good day, even if they're, rude or off-putting to you or just don't want to sign your petition, that goodwill says a lot about the type of person you are and the movement that you're cultivating. This is actually where I took issue with the Andrew Yang campaign, and I resigned to move on to greener pasture. Uh, Internally, there were a lot of idealistic young staffers, brilliant, brilliant, smart colleagues uh, that I feel like are too married to this idea that he's going to win. Even the most popular candidates in the polls still only have 30% chance, right? Politics is very much a gamble. But because they love the cause, they allowed themselves, in my opinion, and I was allowing myself to be exploited a bit. Um, Other campaigns here pay far more, they compensate for gas, and most importantly, they help facilitate housing. So, I've had staffers that, were otherwise going to be houseless, living in their car like I've have had to do throughout my life since graduating college once in a while to afford housing. They weren't facilitating it well, and it was causing everyone a great deal of stress. But one of the senior leadership members told me that this wasn't their problem, that making sure that people have access to affordable housing or a living situation conducive to their success wasn't part of their role. And that's a problem because when you have 6 people to one bathroom, folks are going to be late to work. It's going to cause undue stress. It's going to cause tension that you're already experiencing in a very intensive job where you're making hundreds of phone calls a day. So to keep details brief, I think that you always need to put your volunteers, your colleagues, even your leaders on a pedestal and care about them. Ask them how they're doing and mean it. Ask people how they're doing when you go up to greet them and talk to them about UBI. Because if you care and you listen, you're going to learn a lot more and you're going to be a better communicator for it. What I will say too is that another issue I took with the Yang campaign, and maybe this will get changed in the future, is UBI is no longer a central focus in a lot of their advertising materials. None of the new campaign ads mention universal basic income. We were told as organizers not to bring it up unless the person we were speaking with, unless the voter brought it up. None of the handouts that we have mention universal basic income now. And I feel like that's a problem because what happened was they probably did a focus group. They had 10 people, maybe even 20 or 30 sit in a room and listen to these messages and then decide which one they're going to present to voters. That's going to help you in the polls a bit. Hard to say how much. But the reason why I was excited to be part of that campaign is that it was mainstreaming conversation about a policy that people hadn't thought about. And so I don't know what the end game strategy of that is, but I think it's important in our advocacy efforts, even if a candidate runs for office on basic income, encourage them to really stick with it, because apart from their personal success, we've got to start discussing this policy out in the open and standing up for it. People might not understand it. People might oppose it at first. It's not going to be the most popular thing in a lot of countries. That doesn't matter. That's why you're out there. If it was popular, if it was overwhelmingly popular, it would already be in existence. UBI would already be a reality. So stand up for that, and use other issues too. UBI isn't a panacea to all ills in society, but make it a focus of your campaign, because it does have a ton of potential to help healthcare. The dietary patterns that people follow, whether they smoke, all of these things go back to poverty and economic stress.
Bringing it back to UBI in Taiwan, how do you think we can put people first?
Well, the lesson is this. If you're recruiting volunteers to work toward a referendum, or you're inviting people to a UBI Taiwan event, treat them like you like them, even if you've just met them. Because if you like someone else, they're going to like you. At events, have people introduce themselves to their neighbor. That's another great thing I've learned at political rallies here in the state, is that it's most fun when the candidate says, turn to the person next to you and introduce yourself, because then you have that connection, and it feels a lot more personal rather than watching a slideshow about basic income. You now know someone and you've made friends. Loneliness is killing people too. A lot of folks open their doors to campaigners because they're lonely and they're bored. They want to listen to what you have to say. It also means complimenting rather than criticizing other people's work. For example, Tyler and I had, a riff about the state of the website about a year and a half ago, because I thought it needed to be updated a lot quicker. And instead of, empathizing with him as much as I should have, I criticized you a lot when I probably needed at least like a 70% positive feedback ratio to a 30%. Like, this could be constructively improved. Keep in mind, people make mistakes. People aren't perfect. You're not perfect. So just always be really respectful of your teammates. It also means, being friends with your quote unquote enemy, with the opponent in the race. Like, again, if you treat the people who disagree with you with even a modicum of respect, that could change their mind. They're going to think about that positive interaction later. So think of yourself when you're campaigning as not even necessarily trying to persuade people of basic income, but to associate basic income with a positive experience in their lives. It also means expecting the most of them. I think that one thing the Bernie Sanders campaign has done well in the United States is they make big asks of people. He's asking for big, big changes, and that's more motivating to ask people to volunteer in a big way for big change than asking someone to volunteer in a small way for small change. No one's mobilized around that. They're mobilized by a big cause, by something that matters more than themselves.
What other communication tips do you have?
Sure. The first is, when you're inviting volunteers or mobilizing volunteers, frame questions. Don't ask people, hey, can you volunteer this weekend? Ask them, can you volunteer Saturday or Sunday? Should I see you Saturday or Sunday? Don't leave it as an open-ended question for them to say no, because we're very hardwired just to say no and be nervous about these things. You're really kind of doing them a favor, because people are so prone to say no to experiences they would otherwise really enjoy. So think of it as a service when you frame questions as like, the answer is going to be yes. And then if they say no, don't take it as like a no, I'm never going to volunteer. Ask them if another weekend works for them. Get them involved, because you need a mass group of people to make a change. Second, tailor your message. Ask them how they're doing. They might tell you something interesting about your day that you can tie into your message. Ask them what they would do with $1,000 a month, or the NTD equivalent in Taiwan. Ask them how they feel about the economy. If they say it's doing fine, then maybe share how you think it could do even better for young Taiwanese that are leaving for mainland China, or start they start families that don't have economic stability. And then third, I just say, don't fear rejection, right? Many people will say no to your invitations to events. Many people will not sign your petitions. Many people will think UBI is free money that's going to destroy the economy and it's socialism, blah, 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 blah. It's an important cause. You're making history. And for every two people that say no, one is going to say yes. And the other two will think a lot harder about the issue later on. If it helps, pretend that they were nice to you and said yes. Like, just completely delude yourself into thinking the interaction was positive if it helps you reach more people, because there's going to be a few gems among all the people you reach out to who are going to want to volunteer as well and become part of the movement that makes UBI a reality.
So when we try to fight for UBI on the inside, can you explain a little bit about what that might mean?
Sure. And in just a moment, I want to put the question back to you because you have more experience doing that in Taiwan yourself. I think we should go directly to influencers and people in charge of institutions, not just ordinary people. If campaigns tried to knock on every single door, they would run out of time and money very fast on folks that are not going to vote or don't care. If you're watching this video, you obviously care about these issues. You obviously have a lot at stake. A lot of people do not, and you should not waste your time on them, if they're not going to be part of the solution. If you reach out to people who represent others, elected officials, then they can spread information to more people that way, and they're going to have a bigger impact. In practice, that means that everyone who cares about UBI should be talking to leaders in their community, their elected officials. Turn off this interview and this video and call your, elected officials on your city council, in the national UN. People with power won't hear you unless you actually say something, unless you write them a letter, unless you call them, unless you visit the office. And you would be surprised just how responsive they actually are. They want your vote and support, and if you talk to them, they're going to listen. They're going to come to events. This is not to say that ordinary people don't matter, or people who don't vote don't matter. I think they do. Indeed, caring for these people is a reason to support UBI by targeting the right people to mobilize. In the US, low-income voters have participation rates 30% below that of affluent households and affluent people. Without UBI, poor people cannot afford the necessary documents, replacing a birth certificate, social security card, getting time off work. It's not protected in a lot of states, or transportation to the polls. These are all things that poverty prevents, poor folks from being involved. By finding people to fight by your side who have the time, power, and bandwidth to stand with you, you're ultimately going to give everyone more economic opportunity to be active citizens and be part of this process. But you've got to work with the system that you've been given and really, speak to voters that have come out in the last 2 or 3 elections that are going to, stand by your side and add to the movement.
Well, I'd say you're absolutely right. And in Taiwan, we've had trouble because in a lot of ways we're coming in as a brand new movement. We didn't start because somebody from the top was talking about this. In the United States, you have a lot of folks like Zuckerberg and Elon Musk and a lot of influential people who are talking about UBI even before Andrew Yang. And so it's tough in Taiwan when you can't turn towards somebody who's influential, who's really been discussing this.
Yep.
Later on, of course, we've had some success talking to the digital minister who's been interested in this process, some legislators who have started to move towards discussing this, kind of the folks who were on the outside, who never really felt mainstream and then started to become mainstream. We have more luck with those folks because I think they they're a little bit more open-minded, and they
Hmm.
don't feel that same pressure that maybe somebody who's at the top of the party, who's kind of representing the party, etc.,
Yeah, they're
might
very
feel
fixed
that
in
pressure.
what they can do politically and what they've already
Exactly.
said, and yeah.
So even, I mean, the more mainstream that they get, the more hesitant they are to be the first one to really push this idea. So you have to kind of find that sweet spot of somebody who is just mainstream enough that they have influence,
Yeah,
but not too entrenched that they're not willing to come out and make that statement. So that's that
right.
balance that we're trying to find, and I think we're starting to get there.
Yeah.
Um, we're we're starting to talk to the American Institute here in Taiwan to help us do some events, and I think that's going to really help us make us more of a mainstream topic if we have uh, an influential group like the American
Hmm.
Institute helping us. I think it'll possibly bring some other folks along. So I want to bring it back to you one last time. Do you
Hmm.
have any final thoughts for the viewers?
All I have to say is change does not happen from the top, even if you're going after influencers, right? One person in power supporting this policy isn't going to make a difference if there's widespread opposition. So it's this combination of mobilizing people at the grassroots to care and take their economic destiny into their own hands, while also convincing people of power that they need to listen to the folks at the bottom advocating for it. And so striking that right kind of combination is a difficult thing to do. And I think UBI Taiwan has done an excellent job so far. I encourage you to get in touch with Tyler. He's very accessible. Get in touch with me after this interview and podcast, and ask us questions. Ask how you can become an independent activist, or come to UBI Taiwan's events, or advocate in your country if you're not yet connected to those networks. We're always happy to answer questions and put you in touch with great people. So thank you so much, Tyler, for this interview. I hope it's been useful for everyone. And, Godspeed on making UBI a reality, because it'll mean so much to so many people.